Hello, I'm Mike Smith, and we're going to be talking today about the text from Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. That will be the text for this Sunday sermon. I'll warn you ahead of time, this is kind of a tough one. Some preachers look at this as sort of a slow-pitch text where you can hit it out of the park, use it on a Sunday when you're trying to have a time and talent survey and get people to sign up to do things for the church. But I think the closer a look we take at this parable, the more we're going to see that this is a kind of a screwball that Jesus is throwing at us and not particularly a slow pitch. Let's take a look at the big picture. If you need to pause this a moment to read the parable, please do that so that you have this in your mind as we go through the text here. When we take a look at the whole parable and see it in the big picture, it's not a happy parable. Almost half of this parable focuses on a conflict between two of the characters. One character, for instance, says, "You are a harsh man," and he accuses him of exploiting the work of others, the hard work, the sweat of others for his own personal and selfish gain. In return, the argument goes on. He's accused of being a wicked and lazy man and useless, and so it's important that we notice this about the parable. This is an argument that's going on. And it's also important that we take a look at what the end result is of the parable. This is often left out by preachers. The end result of this parable is tragic for one of the characters. This is a character who's going to have everything taken away from him, and he's going to be cast out into the outer darkness, where there's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's going to be for him a life of poverty, a life where his very survival is going to be in question. So as we look at this parable, again, the big picture is important. Now, I want to make a note of how this parable is typically interpreted by Sunday school teachers and by preachers. It's important to see how we have, over the years, assumed the meaning of this parable and the interpretation of this parable. Here's how it goes. We say God gives everyone talents. I mean, after all, the word talent appears in this particular parable. So then we go on to say, you need to use your talents to help the church. In other words, you need to, if you have the talent to play the piano, you need to do that. Or you need to teach a Sunday school class, and whether you have talent or not. You need to be an usher. You need to be on a committee, we say. If your talent is to be able to repair plumbing, then go fix that urinal in the men's room. Or perhaps your talent is that you have the ability to serve donuts, and so be sure and do that in the parlor the next time we have a fellowship hour. And this is typically how this parable is interpreted. We even, on Sundays when we preach this, we even hand out time and talent sheets in order to get people to contribute to the institution. Now, the third thing about this parable is if you read the whole parable, here's what conclusion you have to draw. If you don't give your talents to the church, you'll go to hell. Now, this is where we see a difference between liberal churches and fundamental churches. Fundamentalist churches will go ahead and preach this whole parable to you and include this, where liberal churches tend to whack off that third point. So in other words, the only way we can really preach this parable in a liberal, progressive, kind-hearted, sweet-spirited church is to whack off the end of the parable. We don't want that third point there. Let's take a look now. Let's go back to the parable, because this is a Bible study, and I think that if we're going to talk about if we're going to preach the parable in a sermon, this is the challenge that I have. I need to know, what does this parable actually say before I can preach a decent sermon on it. Okay, so we look at the parable. First of all, it has four characters. There's a boss, and there are three so-called slaves. Now, that could be interpreted literally, that they could actually be, in a legal sense, slaves of this boss. More than likely, this is a slang term for somebody who's a lieutenant, a puppet. In other words, the boss owns them, in a sense, not legally as slaves, but their future and their economic well-being is so tied up with this boss that they might as well be slaves. And sometimes I think we feel that same way toward the places where we work. We may feel like we're a slave, that we can't get away, that we're stuck in a certain place. So a boss and three so-called slaves. Now in the story, the boss is going to leave on a journey, and he's going to give his liquid assets to his lieutenants to work with. That's what they're going to do with these. Now a talent is, in this particular parable, the word talent that appears in the English versions comes from the Greek word talentos, and it means about $1 million. It's kind of hard for us to make the to be able to say the transposition from ancient economy to modern economy, but a talent in New Testament times is a lot of money, and it's a huge amount of money. It represents decades of what a common laborer would earn. And so I think for our purposes, probably the best way to translate that term would be about $1 million. So he's going to give these he's going to give his liquid assets to these lieutenants of his to work with while he's away. The boss returns. This is how the story goes. They're given this money. Now, two of the lieutenants have done quite well. In fact, they've doubled their money. One lieutenant, however, the third one in the story, has merely kept the $1 million safe that he was given. He has buried it in the ground, hidden it, so that nobody could get it. The first two are rewarded for their work, and the third one is verbally abused, and he's exiled. Now, we need to keep in mind, in this particular world, to be exiled means nobody else is going to hire him once word gets around that this first boss doesn't like him. And the peasants are probably not going to care for him either, because he's always going to be seen as an outsider since he's already worked for this rich guy. It's important in this parable for us to take a quick look at his social and historical background. We're talking about first century Roman Empire here. This is the imperial period of Roman history. And we do know that there were wealthy households. This would be represented by the boss in today's parable, which there were households which had accumulated a number of talents, about 2%. And again, we're not real sure about this, but we do know that it was just a sliver of the population that was this well-to-do. We do also know that the remaining people were extremely poor. They were barely able at times to have enough food to be able to survive. So we know that in this particular at this particular time, in this particular economy, we know that wealth was severely limited. This was not what we would call a growing economy. The only way in this economy that you could get wealth was to take it from other wealthy people or to take it from the poor. That is the only way. There were no new products. By a growing economy, we mean an economy where there are new products being invented, there are new jobs being developed, there are new services being created for people, there are perhaps more efficient means of production increasing the amount of goods and services available to people, which would of course help grow the economy. So we need to remember that this was not a growing economy. This was a pretty static economy, and you didn't get rich by working harder or by becoming more inventive or by being an entrepreneur. You only got rich by taking what was already there from people who had it. New Testament economics. It's a no-growth economy. You could work for a subsistence living. If you were a worker, you barely made it. The only 4 ways to gain wealth, want to emphasize this, you could gain it through taxes Tax collectors, of course, in the New Testament were extremely unpopular. You could gain wealth by exploiting the poor, in other words, loaning them money, taking land, their little land they had as collateral, and then in years of famine and when the crops were off, then of course you could claim the land for yourself. You could foreclose on it. You could get money through inheritance if your relatives were rich, and the other way is through military pillage or through tribute. So this was economics in New Testament times. Okay, back to the story. The boss goes on a journey. This would not be unusual. He's a pretty rich man. He could be going on this trip in order to try to find new markets for his business. He could be going to try to bribe the government. These would be typical activities that would be done. Two lieutenants, while he's gone, in this story, they play the game, and they take the talents that they are given. One has about $5 million to work with. One has about $2 million. The third has about $1 million. Two lieutenants play the game, and one doesn't while the boss is gone. The two who play along are complimented and rewarded, and the one who doesn't play along is condemned and destroyed. And he is destroyed. If he's cast into the outer darkness, a place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, his very survival, his life is at risk at this particular point. And so I just want to say this: let's not abuse this parable by conveniently leaving things out of it just because it may be hard for us to interpret or may be hard for us and offend us here. Now, if we take the parable as it is, how are we going to interpret it? I think that there are two broad interpretive directions that we can take. And if you look at some of the commentaries, you'll see most of the commentaries going this first way. And I also want to share with you, there's a very small minority of people who tend to interpret it more in the direction of the second way I'm going to mention here. The first way of interpreting this parable is to say the boss is like God, the guy who goes away on a journey. And we can find ways that God would be similar to the boss. You could say in this first way of interpreting that God trusts us with great responsibilities, such as feeding the hungry and the growth of the church. You can continue your list here of those responsibilities that have been left to us. We can interpret this parable by saying that like the two servants who were complimented, we too can work hard. We can take what God gives us. Just like Jesus once took 5 loaves and 2 fish and multiplied God's good work, so we can take whatever God puts in our hands and whatever responsibilities, whatever work, whatever resources, and we can multiply these things for the kingdom of God. Or we can be lazy and wicked and useless, like the servant who blamed the boss, who seemed to be critical, who refused to go along with the company plan. That's one way we can interpret this parable. The other interpretive direction would be this. We could say, instead of saying the boss, we could start our interpretation, instead of starting by saying the boss is like God, we could say that the third lieutenant in the story is like Jesus. This would be a very radically different way of interpreting this than most people do. We could say Jesus and the third lieutenant refused to play the game of gaining worldly power. You can read the story of the temptation in the 4th chapter of Matthew. We could say that Jesus is like the third lieutenant, or the third lieutenant is like Jesus, and that he refuses to harm those who are vulnerable. In fact, one of the things Jesus says in the very next parable in Matthew 25 is that he calls us to be the champion of people who are poor and exploited in this world. And the third lieutenant and Jesus have this in common. They are both severely punished for refusing to play the game. In the case of the lieutenant in the parable today, he's cast out in the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. In the case of Jesus, he's going to go to the cross and be executed. And that's going to happen in the very next chapter in Matthew 26 and 27. So we have two interpretive possibilities. Which do you think, if you were the preacher, which way would you go? I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for participating in this Bible study.